You know what Christmas carol might be my favorite? The one we just sang, Hark the Herald Angels Sing. And you know, sometimes it can even bring tears to my eyes. Why? Because of Charlie Brown and George Bailey. That's why. Y'all might remember that song is sung at the end of both Merry Christmas, Charlie Brown, and It's a Wonderful Life. It's sung at the end of both movies. Now, I understand something. I want to be sensitive pastorally. I understand some of you may weep when Hans Gruber falls to his death from Nakatomi Plaza. And others of you may have tears spring from the wells of your souls every time you see Clark Griswold's house finally lit in glorious splendor for all his family to see. But it's old Charlie Brown and George Bailey for me. I grew up watching Merry Christmas, Charlie Brown, and It's a Wonderful Life, but I don't remember crying at the end of those movies when I was a kid. But I do now. It's funny, this thing being a grown-up. You never quite know where the armor will rust or where the heart will soften. But it does. It does. And so when we sing, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, I just can't help it. I just can't help think of those two characters, which is why I've decided to title this sermon, Hark the Herald, Charlie and George Sing. Not the catchiest of titles, I know, but I think it gets the point across, and in more ways than you might realize. And hopefully we'll get to see why this particular Christmas carol connects so wonderfully with their stories, and maybe our own too. But first, a quick history lesson. More of a history snapshot, all right? And it's of another Charlie and George that are important to this story. And that is Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, who wrote the lyrics to Hark the Herald Angels Sing in the year 1739. But Charles Wesley had the first line as this. Listen to this. Hark all the welkin ring. Anybody know what welkin is? I didn't think so. I didn't either. I had to look it up. It means heaven. Hark all the welkin ring. That's how Charles Wesley had the line. But here's how I imagine this scenario going down. George Whitefield approaches Charles Wesley. And because George Whitefield is a laid-back dude, says, hey, Chuck, man, you got to change that first line. And Charles Wesley says, don't call me Chuck. And then George says, 10-4, Big Charlie, but you still got to change that line because in 100 years, nobody's going to know what welkin means. And so George Whitefield got to change the first line to Hark the Herald Angels Sing, right? End of history lesson. Now, back to our other Charlie and George. That is Charlie Brown and George Bailey. You might have noticed in those films, but they're similar in some crucial ways. They're both frustrated. They're both despondent. They both experience inner conflict. Both are wrestling with a deeper sense of purpose, and both communicate a kind of lack of self-worth. Whether it's Charlie Brown with his social awkwardness, struggling to discover the meaning of Christmas, or George Bailey with his busted lip and Zuzu's pedals, struggling to discover the meaning of himself. Both of them in their own ways come to the end of their rope, and both of them are in need. Now, let's switch back over to our other Charlie and George, and that is Charles Wesley and George Whitefield. You know, one of the reasons I love the lyrics to this carol is because of the juxtaposition of the chorus and the verses. Where the chorus may catapult us to the heavens, where angels sing and welcome a newborn king, the verses ground us in the stuff of earth, in the humanness of this holy night. I mean, just listen to some of these words that Charlie and George penned. Veiled in flesh, incarnate deity, pleased as man with man to dwell, Jesus, our Emmanuel. Emmanuel, which means God with us. And this is the line that gets me: light and life to all he brings. See, this is not a God who's ashamed of humanity or embarrassed by the human condition. This is not a God who is so fed up with the whole blasted thing, so here goes a last-ditch effort. No, this is a God who loves creation so much, a God who loves people so deeply, even in all our failures and flaws, our messy relationships and fledgling faith, that this God enters creation in the most vulnerable, fragile way we can think, to show us how to love, to, as the verse says, bring life and light. To who? To all. To all. See, the Christian story is not one of a distant God waving a magic wand or a capricious God shaking a judgmental finger. It is the story of a God who became like us so we could become like him. It is the story of a God whose love was embodied, made tangible, made possible with the very means which you and I were given. Each other. Each other. Which is exactly what Charlie Brown and George Bailey got at the end. An embodied, tangible love made possible with the very means they were given. A community. Charlie Brown standing there awestruck by the care of friends who brought his little scrawny tree to life, and George Bailey, tears rolling down his face, watching his debts be forgiven and the charge brought against him ripped in half and laid on the table, which, by the way, just became an altar. Both of them finding light and life in the presence of a community, by the way, who are all singing "Hark the Herald," the hymn that says, born to raise the sons of earth, born to give them second birth. Because maybe second births come in all kinds of ways throughout our entire lives. At the close of this service, the lights will dim, and we will pass the light of Christ from candle to candle to candle. And I invite you at that time to look around. Look at the people gathered here on this holy night. Look at the flickering orange glow of flame illuminating their faces. May it remind you of those words sung. Whether it was Charles Wesley or Charlie Brown, George Whitefield or George Bailey, all the voices down through the generations, light and life to all he brings. All of us gathered here, a community of light and life in the name of the one born into this world who brought us light and life and still does.